The general walked past her, his boots crunching on the gravel with the easy authority of a man who commanded legions. He offered a perfunctory nod to the cluster of officers near the command tent, his mind already on the impending sandstorm and the tactical vulnerabilities it would create. She was just another non-commissioned officer in his peripheral vision, a static part of the landscape of forward operating base Kodiak. Then, his practiced gaze snagged on a detail, and he froze mid-stride. He took a half-step back, his eyes narrowing, disbelief warring with the undeniable truth sewn onto her uniform. It was a small, faded badge, almost invisible against the camouflage pattern. A mountain peak bisected by a lightning bolt, with the impossibly small inscription, 10,000 feet, the silent proclamation of a ghost. ####1. Arrival and anonymity. Master Sergeant Anya Sharma's arrival at FOB Kodiak was as quiet and unassuming as the dust that settled on everything. The C-130's ramp lowered with a hydraulic sigh, blasting the interior with superheated air that smelled of grit and altitude sickness. The other passengers, a squad of fresh-faced infantry replacements, buzzing with nervous energy, jostled their way into the blinding afternoon sun. Sharma waited, her movements economical and unhurried. She shouldered a single, nondescript duffel bag, its weight perfectly balanced, and walked down the ramp without a wasted motion. FOB Kodiak was a scar on the face of a brutal landscape. Perched at over 8,000 feet in a remote mountain range, it was a fortress of HESCO barriers and concertina wire against a backdrop of serrated, stone-gray peaks. The air was thin, a constant, wearying thief of breath. The sun was a merciless hammer. To Sharma, it felt familiar. The hostility of the environment was just another variable, a known quantity to be factored into the equation of survival. Her assignment papers directed her to the S4 logistics hub. The logistics officer, a harried-looking captain, glanced at her orders, his eyes scanning for keywords. He saw administrative transfer, records management, and a long list of previous postings that were so heavily redacted they looked like checkerboards. He sighed. Bureaucracy had sent him another paper pusher. "Master Sergeant," he said, not bothering to make eye contact as he scribbled on a clipboard, "you're assigned to inventory management. Specialist Evans will show you to your workspace. Keep the manifests updated. Everything that comes in or goes out gets logged. No exceptions." "Understood, sir," Sharma replied. Her voice was level, carrying no hint of protest or disappointment. Specialist Evans, a young soldier barely out of his teens, led her to a cavernous tent filled with the scent of canvas, gun oil, and stale coffee. Racks of supplies, crates of munitions, and stacks of paperwork created a claustrophobic maze. Her workspace was a small metal desk with a flickering computer monitor and a chair that listed slightly to the left. "Here you go, Master Sergeant," Evans said, shifting his weight awkwardly. He saw a woman of medium height, with a disciplined physique that her loose-fitting uniform couldn't entirely conceal. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe regulation bun. Her face was a mask of placid neutrality, but her eyes were different. They moved constantly, not with nervousness, but with a deep, methodical awareness. They noted the placement of the fire extinguishers, the frayed wiring near the generator, the way the tent flaps billowed with the prevailing wind. She set her duffel bag down and began to organize her small space with meticulous precision. A pen, a notepad, a water bottle each placed in a specific spot, creating an island of order in the surrounding chaos. Other soldiers in the tent glanced at her, sized her up, and dismissed her. Just another rear echelon NCO, probably sent to the front to tick a box before retirement. She was invisible, and for now that suited her perfectly. ###2. The weight of dismissal. 2 days later, Colonel Marcus Thorne summoned her to his office. Thorne was a man carved from the same unforgiving rock as the mountains surrounding the FOB. He was a career infantry officer who believed wars were won with grit, aggression, and clearly defined lines of authority. He did not believe they were won with paperwork. His office, the nerve center of the base, was a sterile, plywood box, its only decoration a massive topographical map of the sector that covered an entire wall. Red markers indicated known enemy positions. Blue markers traced the predictable paths of coalition patrols. Thorne stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back, a posture of command he had perfected over 2 decades. He didn't invite Sharma to sit. He gestured to the file on his desk, her own. "Master Sergeant Sharma, I've reviewed your transfer orders."
Frankly, I'm baffled.
He picked up the file, its pages thin and flimsy in his powerful hands. "This document is 90% black ink. Your MOS is listed as logistics specialist, yet your prior assignments are classified. You have qualifications in fields that have nothing to do with counting ammunition boxes. An administrative transfer to a high-threat forward operating base. It smells like a mistake from command." Sharma stood at parade rest, her gaze fixed on a point on the wall just over his shoulder. "I go where I'm assigned, sir." Thorne let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't we all?" He tossed the file back onto his desk. The sound was a sharp crack in the quiet room. "Look, Master Sergeant, let's be direct. This is not a records office in Virginia. We are on the sharp end of the spear here. My people face daily threats from an enemy that is skilled, ruthless, and knows this terrain better than we do. I don't have room for personnel who can't pull their weight in a firefight." His tone was laced with condescension, the practiced dismissal of a field commander for anyone he perceived as REMF rear echelon mother figure. "I need to know if you can handle your duties when the alarms are sounding and things get kinetic," he pressed. "I trust you can handle filing under pressure." Inside, Sharma felt nothing.
No anger, no resentment.
His skepticism was a predictable obstacle, like a misaligned scope or a sudden gust of wind. It was something to be acknowledged, processed, and overcome, not with words, but with action. She had faced men like Thorne her entire career, men who saw the world in rigid categories, who judged capability based on a uniform's creases or a job title. They were consistently and sometimes fatally wrong. She met his gaze directly, her own eyes unblinking. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice calm and absolute. "I'll manage." He stared at her for a long moment, searching for a flicker of doubt or weakness. He found none. He found an unnerving stillness, a depth he couldn't quite fathom and therefore distrusted. "Dismissed," he said, turning back to his map, a clear signal that she was no longer worth his time. ####3. The art of observation. Sharma returned to the logistics tent and the monotonous rhythm of her duties. She processed requisitions for spare vehicle parts, tracked fuel consumption, and cross-referenced ammunition inventories. The work was tedious, a stark contrast to the visceral, high-stakes precision of her former life. But to her, information was a weapon system, and her new post was an invaluable listening post. She used the dull routine as a cover for a far more critical task. Observation. While her hands typed and her mouse clicked, her mind was mapping the pulse of FOB Kodiak. She learned the base's routines, its strengths, and, more importantly, its vulnerabilities. She noted the patrol schedules, which were efficient but predictable. A clever enemy could time an attack to the minute. She saw how the surveillance drones favored the southern and eastern approaches, leaving the northern perimeter, with its treacherous cliffs, monitored with less frequency. The guards in Tower 4 were diligent. The ones in Tower 6 grew complacent after midnight. A slight sag in the northern perimeter fence, just behind the motor pool, was large enough for a single person to crawl through undetected. From the constant flow of supply requests, she built a profile of the base's operational readiness. She knew which platoon was running low on 40mm grenades, which striker had a recurring transmission problem, and which radio frequencies were most heavily used. Her attention was most often drawn to the firing range, a dusty patch of ground on the western edge of the base. There, she watched the designated marksman practice. She observed Sergeant Miller, the lead sniper of the base's countersniper team. He was talented, with a natural feel for his weapon, but he was also arrogant. He relied on instinct over calculation, and his breathing was inconsistent under pressure, causing his shot groups to widen at longer distances. He was good, but not good enough for the unforgiving environment that lay beyond the wire. But it was the landscape itself that she studied most intensely. Every morning, before her shift began, she would stand with a cup of coffee and simply watch the mountains. She committed every ridge, every gully, every shadow to memory. She watched the way the wind moved through the high passes, reading the subtle dance of dust devils and the lean of the sparse, hardy vegetation. She ran endless tactical scenarios in her mind, plotting ingress and egress routes, identifying likely enemy observation posts, and calculating fields of fire. Her gaze repeatedly settled on one particular geological feature: a sharp, needle-like ridge far to the northeast, a place the base's threat assessment maps labeled as non-viable enemy position, extreme range. Everyone else ignored it. Sharma saw it for what it was: the perfect sniper hide. It offered a commanding view of the primary supply route leading to the base. The distance was immense, well over 2,500 meters. The air would be thin and turbulent. A shot from there would be, by any conventional military doctrine, impossible. And that, she knew, was exactly why a truly elite enemy would choose it. ####4. Pressure point. The crisis began not with a bang, but with a crackle of static over the radio. A high-value convoy, codenamed Pathfinder, was transporting advanced surveillance equipment to a remote outpost. It was 3 miles from the relative safety of FOB Kodiak when the world fell apart. The first report was confused. The lead vehicle's engine block had been shattered by a single high-caliber round.
Impossible.
The convoy security detail reported no muzzle flash, no sound of a shot over the roar of their engines and the wind. Minutes later, the trailing vehicle's communications antenna was sheared clean off, isolating them. The convoy was a sitting duck. The Tactical Operations Center, TOC, descended into controlled chaos. Colonel Thorne stood before the main screen, which displayed a grainy drone feed of the stranded vehicles. His face was a thunderous mask of frustration. "Where is the fire coming from?" he barked at the intelligence officer. "We don't know, sir. There's nothing on thermal, no muzzle signatures. They're completely exposed on that road." The radio crackled again. The voice of the convoy commander strained with panic. "TOC, this is Pathfinder 6. We have another impact. Disabling shot on Striker 2's tires. They're picking us apart. We can't see them." Sergeant Miller and his countersniper team were scrambled to the perimeter. From the highest observation tower, they scanned the surrounding landscape, their high-powered optics searching for any sign of the phantom shooter. "I've got nothing, sir," Miller reported, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a tense edge of disbelief. "The only possible position with that kind of angle is Ridge 34 Delta, but that's got to be over 2,500 meters. No one can make that shot." "You have your orders, Sergeant. Engage any potential targets," Thorne commanded. The deep, throaty boom of Miller's .50 caliber rifle echoed across the base. In the TOC, they watched the drone feed, hoping to see a puff of dust where the bullet impacted. The round fell short, kicking up dirt 100 meters shy of the ridge. Another shot went wide, snatched by an invisible crosswind. "Sir, the wind is a monster up there." Miller's voice was frayed. "I can't get a stable reading. It's impossible. The target is out of our effective range." Panic began to curdle the air in the TOC. The convoy was being systematically dismantled by an enemy they couldn't see, from a distance they couldn't reach. Air support, their usual trump card, was unavailable. The sandstorm that General Sterling had been worried about had arrived early, grounding all helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. Thorne's options were evaporating with every passing second. He slammed his fist on the console, the metallic clang echoing the grim reality of their situation. They were helpless. Through it all, in the adjacent logistics tent, Master Sergeant Sharma had been listening. She heard the rising panic in the radio calls, the futile boom of Miller's rifle. She cross-referenced the convoy's grid coordinates with the mental map she had been building for weeks. She knew exactly where the sniper was, and she knew exactly what had to be done. ###5.
Inévitable intervention.
Sharma set down the inventory manifest she had been holding. She walked out of the logistics tent and into the swirling dust, her steps measured and deliberate. The entrance to the TOC was guarded by 2 soldiers who moved to block her way, but she passed between them with such quiet, undeniable purpose that they simply stepped aside. She entered the tense, dimly lit room and the chaotic energy washed over her. She ignored the frantic officers and technicians hunched over their consoles. She ignored the incredulous stare from Colonel Thorne, who was about to demand what a logistics sergeant was doing in his command center during a crisis. Her focus was absolute. She walked directly to the large, wall-mounted topographical map, the one Thorne had stood before when he dismissed her. Her finger traced a line from the stranded convoy's position to a familiar, needle-like peak far to the northeast. "What's the last reported wind speed and direction at the target's elevation?" Her voice was calm, cutting through the nervous chatter like a scalpel. It wasn't loud, but it commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Thorne opened his mouth to reprimand her, but the sheer, unwavering certainty in her tone stopped him. He was a man who recognized competence, even when it appeared in the most unexpected form. It was Specialist Evans, the young soldier from logistics, who answered, reading from a monitor. Coming from 270 at 15 knots, gusting to 20, Master Sergeant." Sharma absorbed the data, her eyes scanning the contour lines on the map. She was no longer seeing a map. She was seeing a firing problem in 3 dimensions. Altitude differential, air density, humidity, barometric pressure. The variables scrolled through her mind, not as abstract numbers, but as tangible forces she could feel and predict. She turned from the map, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces in the TOC before landing on Sergeant Miller's image on a secondary monitor. "Give me Sergeant Miller's rifle," she said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, an assertion of necessity. "And his spotter." A heavy silence fell over the TOC. Thorne stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the unassuming clerk from his office with the woman of impossible calm who now stood before him. In the vacuum of his indecision, her quiet confidence became the most powerful force in the room. "Do it!" Thorne finally clipped out, his voice rough. Sharma didn't wait for confirmation. She was already moving towards the exit, heading for the main observation tower on the northern perimeter. She moved without haste, her stride smooth and efficient. There was no bravado, no dramatic speech. There was only the quiet, lethal focus of a master craftsman approaching her work. The other soldiers watched her go, a mix of awe and bewilderment on their faces. They were witnessing a tectonic shift, the moment a person they thought they knew ceased to be one thing and began to become something else entirely. Something they couldn't yet comprehend. ###6. The long silence. On the tower, the wind was a physical force, tearing at her uniform and trying to steal the breath from her lungs. Sergeant Miller reluctantly handed over his Barrett M107, its heavy frame warm from his recent, failed attempts. His spotter, a corporal, looked at Sharma with wide, uncertain eyes. Sharma took the rifle. Her hands moved over the weapon with an intimacy that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. It was not just a tool to her. It was an extension of her will. She checked the seating of the magazine, wiped a speck of dust from the lens of the high-powered scope, and settled the weapon onto its bipod. Her movements were a fluid, unbroken dance of practiced economy. She lay prone on the platform, her body becoming one with the steel and the concrete. "Give me the data," she said to the corporal, her voice muffled slightly by the stock pressed against her cheek. In the TOC, everyone was gathered around the drone feed. The skepticism was still palpable, a thick, heavy presence in the air. Colonel Thorne stood with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He had given the order, but he still couldn't believe what he was seeing. A clerk was about to attempt a shot his best sniper had declared impossible. The corporal began calling out the numbers, his voice shaky. Range, 2640 meters. Wind, holding at 15 knots, 9 o'clock. Incline, +7 degrees. Sharma didn't respond. The world outside the circle of her scope had ceased to exist. There was only the target, a microscopic shimmer of heat and distorted light on a distant ridge, and the intricate physics of the bullet's flight. Her inner monologue was a silent, rapid-fire calculation. Coriolis effect will pull it left. Spin drift, right? The altitude thins the air, less drag. But the crosswind at the midway point will be chaotic. Wind is a river, not a wall. Don't fight it. Find the current and ride it. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate until she could feel the faint, steady beat in her fingertips. In the pause between one beat and the next, a moment of perfect, crystalline stillness, she exhaled half her breath and squeezed the trigger. The recoil was a solid, familiar punch to her shoulder, a force she absorbed into her body without disturbing the rifle's aim. The .50 caliber round left the barrel at over 2,800 feet per second, a hypersonic projectile on a 3-second journey across the valley. In the TOC, the silence was absolute. 3 seconds felt like an eternity. They stared at the drone feed, at the distant, sun-bleached ridge. Nothing happened. A collective sigh of disappointment began to form. Then, the glint of the enemy's scope. A tiny star of reflected light that had been invisible to everyone but her vanished. A small puff of rock dust erupted from the precise spot where it had been. The radio crackled to life, the voice of the Pathfinder 6 commander raw with disbelief and relief. TOC. Be advised, hostile sniper is neutralized. I repeat, target is down. Holy, how in the hell? A wave of stunned murmurs washed through the TOC. Sergeant Miller, watching through his own scope from a lower position, slowly lowered his binoculars, his mouth agape. Colonel Thorne stared at the screen, then turned his gaze to the tower. He saw the small, solitary figure of Master Sergeant Sharma getting to her feet. She methodically cleared the rifle, handed it back to the corporal, and began walking back towards the TOC as if she had just finished some light-range practice. Curiosity was no longer the right word for what Thorne felt. It was a profound, unsettling sense of awe. ###7. The second test. The relief in the TOC was short-lived. The neutralized sniper, it turned out, was not the primary threat. He was the bait. Intelligence, pieced together from fragmented chatter intercepted after the shot, painted a much grimmer picture. The attack was a sophisticated screening action designed to isolate the convoy for a high-level ambush. The target was the convoy's cargo, but the prize was the man orchestrating the attack. Tariq Al-Azmari, a notorious and elusive insurgent commander who had been on the coalition's kill or capture list for over a year. The single, impossible shot had thrown his plan into chaos. Now, instead of springing his ambush, he was trying to escape. A new drone feed showed a 2-vehicle convoy speeding away from the ambush site, heading for a narrow mountain pass that led into the neighboring, lawless province. He's making a run for the border, the intelligence officer announced, pointing to the map. Once he's through the Sheik Pass, he's gone. We'll never get him. The sandstorm, which had briefly abated, was now returning with a vengeance. The wind howled outside, rattling the walls of the TOC. Visibility was dropping fast. What's the window? Thorne demanded. Less than 5 minutes, sir. At his current speed, that's all we've got before he's out of our line of sight, and the storm makes any drone observation impossible. This time, there was no hesitation. Colonel Thorne turned and walked out of the TOC, striding directly towards Sharma, who was wiping the dust from her hands on a rag. He met her halfway, the wind whipping grit around them. The condescension was gone from his face, replaced by a grim urgency. "Master Sergeant," he said, his voice loud enough to be heard over the rising gale. "We have a new target, the insurgent leader, Al-Azmari. He's escaping through the Sheik Pass." He pointed towards a different set of mountains, their peaks already being swallowed by the ochre clouds of the storm. "The window is closing. It's a much harder shot. The target is moving, and the weather is turning to hell." Sharma's expression didn't change. She simply looked towards the pass, her eyes seeming to pierce through the storm itself. She gave a single, decisive nod. She didn't ask for Miller's rifle this time. "The armory," she said, her voice clipped and precise. "There should be a Kennings M200 intervention in a hard case in the rear. It's likely logged under obsolete equipment." The armorer, a grizzled chief warrant officer, looked at her as if she'd grown a second head when she made the request. He had to dig behind crates of standard-issue rifles to find the case. The M200 was a beast of a weapon, a specialized extreme long-range rifle chambered in 408 Chatak. It was a legend, a rifle built for distances that defied belief, but it was notoriously difficult to master. It had been sitting in his armory, untouched, for years. Sharma opened the case. She assembled the weapon with the same practiced fluidity as before, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision. She didn't take it to the observation tower. Instead, she pointed to the highest point on the base, a rocky outcrop that housed a communications relay dish. It was exposed, battered by the full force of the storm, but it offered the best and only angle. She climbed the outcrop alone. She didn't ask for a spotter. She wouldn't need one. For a shot like this, the numbers were only part of the solution. The rest was instinct. It was art. She would read the wind herself, using the swirling patterns of sand and the sway of the communications antenna as her guide. She wedged herself between two boulders, creating a stable platform against the gale, and became a part of the mountain. ####8. A legend revealed. Just as Sharma was settling into her firing position, the roar of a Black Hawk helicopter battling the fierce winds announced an unexpected arrival. It landed heavily, its rotors kicking up a blinding vortex of sand. The side door slid open and General Caden Sterling stepped out, his aide close behind. A four-star general with oversight of the entire regional conflict, Sterling had been en route to a strategic command meeting when the storm had forced his pilot to divert to the nearest secure location, FOB Kodiak. He strode into the TOC, brushing dust from his uniform, his presence immediately commanding the room. "Colonel, give me a sitrep," he ordered, his sharp eyes taking in the tense atmosphere. Thorne, startled by the general's sudden appearance, quickly brought him up to speed. He explained the initial sniper attack, the stranded convoy, and the revelation of Al-Azmari's presence. He concluded by pointing to the main drone feed, which showed a pair of distant vehicles racing towards a mountain pass, periodically vanishing into clouds of sand. "And we have a shooter attempting to interdict him," Thorne finished. "It's a long shot, Colonel." He omitted the part about the shooter being a logistics sergeant. It felt absurd to say out loud, especially to a four-star general. Sterling stepped closer to the screen, his interest piqued. "A long shot is an understatement in this weather. Who's on the rifle?" "Master Sergeant Sharma, sir," Thorne answered, his voice tight. The general nodded, the name meaning nothing to him. He watched the drone feed, his experienced eyes analyzing the tactical situation. Then his gaze shifted to a secondary camera feed, a security camera pointed at the communications relay on the outcrop. It showed a lone, prone figure, braced against the howling wind, the long, distinctive profile of an M200 rifle perfectly still in the gale. Something about the shooter's posture, the impossibly low profile, the perfect union of body and weapon, the utter stillness in the heart of the storm, triggered a memory deep in Sterling's mind. It was a form he had seen once before, years ago, during a classified demonstration at a black site range in Nevada. On the outcrop, Sharma's world had contracted to the reticle of her scope and the wind. She was leading the vehicle, calculating its speed, the bullet's flight time, the wind's deflection. It was the most complex firing solution she had ever attempted. The wind was not a river now. It was a raging, unpredictable sea. She fired. The M200's report was a sharp, piercing crack that was almost swallowed by the storm. In the TOC, they watched the drone feed. The bullet's journey was nearly 7 seconds long. For 7 seconds, history hung in the balance. Then, the lead vehicle on the screen, the one carrying Al-Azmari, swerved violently. His front tire had disintegrated. The vehicle flipped, rolling over and over in a cloud of dust and debris before coming to rest in a mangled heap against the canyon wall. The escape was over. The ambush was broken. The leader was neutralized. A collective, breathless cheer erupted in the TOC. Colonel Thorne stared, speechless, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of a console. General Sterling's face was pale. The familiarity of the shooter's form coalesced with the impossible result. He turned and walked briskly towards the exit. "I want to see this Master Sergeant," he said to no one in particular. He walked out into the maelstrom just as Sharma was climbing down from the outcrop, the heavy rifle slung over her shoulder. Her face was smudged with dust and grime. He walked past her, his mind still processing the events. He was a general, she was a sergeant. He was about to continue towards the awestruck Colonel Thorne, when his eyes fell. He froze. He stopped so abruptly his aide almost collided with him. He took a half-step back, his gaze locked on the small, faded badge on her uniform, partially obscured by a strap of her gear. A mountain peak.
A lightning bolt. 10,000 FT.
It wasn't a badge. It was a myth, a marker for the members of a unit so secret that it officially didn't exist. "My God," Sterling whispered, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. He turned to look fully at the unassuming woman before him. "It can't be. Spectre?" The call sign hung in the air, a name spoken only in hushed tones in the highest echelons of special operations. Thorne, who had followed the general out, heard the name and was confused. "Sir?" Sterling didn't take his eyes off Sharma. "Colonel," he said, his voice low and intense, "that is not a logistics sergeant. That is Master Sergeant Anya Sharma. I was on her selection board 10 years ago. They called her Spectre. She was the lead instructor and co-creator of the Tier 0 Extreme Long-Range Interdiction Program. That badge, they only ever issued 3. It signifies a confirmed, witnessed kill beyond 3,000 meters, 10,000 feet. Her file is redacted because her entire unit was officially and permanently decommissioned. ####9. A salute in the dust. The general's words spread through the TOC like a shockwave. The soldiers who had overheard the exchange at the entrance stared out into the wind-swept compound, their expressions shifting from relief to stunned disbelief, and finally, to pure, unadulterated awe. Sergeant Miller, who had just returned from the tower, looked as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. The arrogant marksman who had dismissed the shot as impossible was now staring at the living embodiment of that impossibility. Specialist Evans, standing near the door, simply looked at Sharma with a reverence usually reserved for deities. Sharma, however, seemed oblivious to the momentous revelation swirling around her. Her mission was complete. Her only thought now was to return the specialized rifle to the armory, to clean it with the respect it deserved, and to restore order. The accolades, the reputation, they were distractions, unwanted noise in a life dedicated to signal. She started walking across the dusty compound, her path taking her directly through the center of the base. It was then that General Sterling moved to intercept her. He didn't run. He walked with a purpose that parted the soldiers who were beginning to emerge from the tents, drawn by the sudden shift in atmosphere. He stopped directly in her path, forcing her to halt. The 4-star general and the master sergeant stood face to face, the wind whipping dust around their boots. For a long moment, no words were spoken. In that space, rank and protocol dissolved, leaving only the elemental truth of two warriors. General Sterling raised his right hand to the brim of his patrol cap. He rendered a slow, deliberate salute. It was not the crisp, perfunctory gesture of daily military life. It was a salute of profound, deeply felt respect, the kind a soldier gives to a memorial, to a flag being lowered in battle, or to a living legend. Colonel Thorne, standing a few feet away, was struck by the power of the gesture. Humbled, ashamed of his initial arrogance and blindness, he immediately followed his superior's lead, his own salute sharp and rigid. And then, a remarkable thing happened. Across the compound, the quiet reverence became a public one. A mechanic, wiping grease from his hands, saw the general's salute and snapped to attention, his own hand flying up. A young infantryman on guard duty on the perimeter wall saw it and did the same. The cooks from the mess tent, the pilots who had been grounded by the storm, the intelligence analysts, the medics, one by one they stopped what they were doing. They turned to face the lone master sergeant in the center of the compound, and in a silent, rippling wave of motion, they all saluted. The sound of the bass died away, replaced by the solitary howl of the wind. Sharma, caught in this silent, powerful tribute, stood perfectly still. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her stoic features. It was not pride. It was not triumph. It was a quiet, weary acknowledgement of a past she could never escape and a skill she could never truly put aside. With perfect, precise form, she returned the general's salute. ####10. The quiet aftermath. The moment held, suspended in time, then it passed. The general lowered his hand, and the wave of salutes across the base receded. The quiet industry of FOB Kodiak slowly resumed, but the emotional topography of the place had been irrevocably altered. A myth had walked among them, and nothing would ever look quite the same. Sharma gave a final, brief nod to the general and continued on her way to the armory. Her pace did not change. Her expression returned to its placid neutrality. She was the same woman who had arrived on the C-130, the same woman who had calmly processed supply manifests that morning. The world around her had changed its perception of her, but she remained constant. The final, symbolic image of the day unfolded in the quiet solitude of the armory. The setting sun, breaking through the dissipating edge of the sandstorm, cast long, dramatic shadows through the building's small, grimy windows. Shafts of golden light illuminated the swirling dust motes, turning the air thick and heavy. Sharma worked in this cathedral of light, meticulously cleaning the M200 intervention. She had disassembled the weapon down to its core components, each piece laid out in perfect order on a clean cloth. The only sound was the rhythmic, hypnotizing whisper of the cleaning rods sliding down the barrel, the soft click of metal parts being reassembled with an expert's touch. Specialist Evans appeared in the doorway, a canteen of water in his hand. He hesitated, unsure of what to say, how to address the legend who, just hours before, had been his unassuming superior in the logistics tent. The gulf between what he thought he knew and what he now knew was too vast to be bridged by casual words. He walked forward silently and placed the canteen on the workbench beside her, the metal making a soft clink. "Thank you, Master Sergeant," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was all he could offer. He turned and left her to her work. Sharma paused, her hands still. She looked at the canteen, then finished her work, her movements as precise and unhurried as ever. Once the rifle was perfectly reassembled and locked back in its case, she stood and walked to the small armory window. She looked out, her gaze fixed on the distant Sheik Pass, its treacherous peaks now softened and painted in the deep purple hues of twilight. The respect was earned, not demanded. Her dignity remained, as it always had, in the quiet competence of her actions, not in the noise of a reputation she never wanted. She was a silent guardian, content to be overlooked, but always ready when the impossible was asked. The legend of Spectre was now known to the inhabitants of FOB Kodiak, but it would remain where it truly belonged, not in stories told over meals, but in the lingering image of two impossible shots, and in the profound, abiding silence that followed.